A very good afternoon and welcome to the World News Review on Independent Television Abuja. I am Kiri Omuli. Officials said a suicide bomb attack at a registration center in the Afghan capital of Kabul has killed at least 57 people. For this and more, let's join Gabriel Kuma.
Officials say a suicide bomb attack at the voter registration center in Afghan capital Kabul has killed at least 57 people. The dead include 21 women and 5 children killed when the blast hit the queue outside. A further 119 people were injured. The Islamic State group said it had carried out the attacks. Voter registration began this month for legislative elections which are due to take place in October. IS mouthpiece said a suicide bomber wearing an explosive belt had targeted the center, which is in the Dashtil Barch area of western Kabul. Children were standing in line with their parents, waiting to register when the bomb went off on Sunday morning. Israel's defense minister has dismissed suggestions that spy agent Mossad has assassinated a Palestinian lecturer who was shot dead in Malaysia on Saturday. Advido Lieberman said it was likely that Fadi al-Basht, 35, was killed as part of an internal Palestinian dispute. 2 men on a motorbike fired 10 shots, killing the Hamas member on a street in the capital, Kuala Lumpur. His wife has accused Mossad of being behind the killing. Mr. Lieberman told the Israeli radio that the scientist was a rocket expert and no saint. Hamas has accused Israel of conducting assassinations of its experts abroad in the past, although Mossad has never confirmed such operations. A travel company says 4 British people have died and 12 others have been injured in a coach crashed in Saudi Arabia. They were from Blackburn and Preston, traveling to Mecca on a pilgrimage. Travel company Hashim Travel said the coach they were on was hit by a fuel tanker, which then caught fire and set the bus alight. The Foreign Office says it is aware British nationals have been killed in an accident in Saudi Arabia. Kenyan runners have dominated this year's London Marathon, with Eliud Kipchoge winning his 3rd title, while Vivian Cheruiyot won the women's race. Kipchoge finished in 2 hours, 6 minutes and 27 seconds in front of Ethiopia's Tola Shura Kitata and the UK's Mo Farah. Cheruiyot won in 2 hours, 18 minutes and 31 seconds, a personal best time. She came ahead of her compatriot Bridget Kosgei and Ethiopia's Tawdalek Bekele. Kipchoge, regarded as one of the greatest marathon runners of all time, was on course for a new world record, but slowed in the final stage of a grueling race in record warm temperatures.
At least 20 people attending a wedding party in northern Yemen, including the bride, are reported to have been killed in an airstrike. Medics and residents say more than 30 others were also injured in the attack late on Sunday. The rebel Houthi movement blamed the airstrike on a coalition that is supporting Yemeni's government and the country's 3-year civil war. The coalition spokesman said the report will be fully investigated. The coalition insists it's never deliberately targets civilians, but human rights groups have accused it of bombing markets, schools, hospitals, and residential areas. Angolan President João Lourenço has sacked his army chief and head of the Foreign Secret Service. This is the president's latest plot against officials with links to his predecessor or those tainted by corruption allegation. José Eduardo dos Santos stepped down as president last September after 37 years. Mr. Lourenço, nicknamed Jello, was handpicked by Mr. dos Santos to succeed him, and at the time, analysts expected him to maintain the status quo. Army Chief General Geraldo Scavchempinko Nunda was named by prosecutors last month as a suspect in a corruption probe. Armenian Prime Minister Sargsyan has resigned after days of large-scale street protests against him. Opposition supporters accused Mr. Sargsyan of clinging to power when he was appointed Prime Minister last Tuesday, soon after finishing 2 5-year terms as president. It was not clear when his resignation will take effect. The announcement came soon after opposition leader Nikol Pashinyan was released from detention. Mr. Pashian has been arrested on Sunday after televised talk with Mr. Zakisian collapsed. 2 other opposition politicians and some 200 demonstrators, as well as Mr. Pashian, were held. Thousands of nurses have returned to work in Zimbabwe despite their demand not being met. Let's join Charity Tanko for this and more on the foreign scene.
Thousands of nurses have returned to work and embarked on a strike last week, complaining of poor pay and a lack of medicines in the state-run health sector. Vice President Constantino Chiwenga, the former army chief who was central to Austin's long-serving ruler Robert Mugabe last year, retaliated by sacking them in the interest of patients and of saving lives. At least 20 people attending a wedding party in northern Yemen, including the bride, are reported to have been killed in an airstrike. Medics and residents said more than 30 others were also injured in the attack late on Sunday in Bani Quest district. The rebel Houthi movement blamed the raid on a Saudi-led coalition that is supporting Yemen's government in the country's 3-year civil war. A coalition spokesman said the reports will be fully investigated. The coalition insists it never deliberately targets civilians, but human rights groups have accused it of bombing markets, schools, hospitals and residential areas. Salah Abdel Salam, the sole surviving suspect from the 2015 Paris attacks, has been jailed for 20 years in Belgium over a gunfight that led to his arrest. Abdel Salam, 28, and co-defendant Sofian Ayari were both convicted of terror-related charges of attempted murder. Ayari, 24, was also given a 20-year sentence. Both fired on officers who raided a flat in Brussels in 2016. Abdel Salam is being held in a jail in France and is due to face trial there over the Paris attacks themselves. He had refused to answer questions from the judge in the trial in Brussels and eventually refused to attend the hearings. Neither he nor Ayari, a 24-year-old Tunisian national, was in court as the verdict was read out on Monday. Both received the maximum 20-year term requested by prosecutors. The judge, Marie-France Cotte-Ghent, said that there can be no doubt about the two men's involvement with radicalism. On 15 March 2016, Belgian police hunting Abdel Salam carried out a raid in the forest area of Brussels.
An Egyptian military court has sentenced a former anti-corruption chief to 5 years in jail. For this and more, let's join Gabriel Kuma.
The United Nations says a Nepalese peacekeeper in South Sudan has been accused of inappropriately torturing a teenage girl in exchange for money. The allegations in the town of Awai comes 2 months after 46 Ghanaian peacekeepers were recalled when some members allegedly paid local women living in a protection camp in the town of Wau for sex. The UN statement says an investigation into the latest allegation is underway. Multiple UN peacekeeping missions have faced allegations of sexual abuse or exploitation in recent years, with Secretary General Antonio Guterres calling it a global menace that must end. The UN has about 15,000 peacekeepers in South Sudan, whom civil war is well into a 5th year. An Egyptian military court has sentenced a former anti-corruption chief, Hisham Genaina, to 5 years in jail, charged with spreading news that harms the army. The military detained Genaina in February following an interview he gave to HuffPost Arabi, the Arabic version of the US news site. In the interview, he said former Armed Forces Chief General Sami Anan possessed documents that were damning of senior Egyptian officials. He gave no details. Genaina, a qualified judge, was sacked by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi as head of the Central Auditing Authority in 2016 after he was accused of exaggerating the cost of corruption in Egypt. Pakistan's military says suicide bombers blew up themselves near a police vehicle and a security checkpoint in separate incidents in the southwestern city of Quetta, killing 5 police and wounding 8 paramilitary troops. A military statement Tuesday says a suicide bomber targeted a police vehicle on an airport road, killing 5 police and wounding 7 others. Separately, the statement says 2 suicide bombers walked to the frontier core checkpoint in the Mien Godi area and detonated explosive vests minutes apart when paramilitaries fired on them. Police officer Mohammed Aslam said 8 wounded troops were hospitalized. No group claimed responsibility, but Islamic militants operating in the region have claimed such past attacks.
Israel has scrapped plans to forcibly deport tens of thousands of illegal African migrants. In a written response to the country's Supreme Court, the government said forced removal of the migrants is no longer on the agenda. It said, however, Israel's immigration authorities are still seeking ways to deport migrants voluntarily. The fate of Israel's roughly 30,000 illegal African migrants have become a hugely contentious issue. The Supreme Court previously suspended a plan to expel the migrants, mostly from Eritrea and Sudan, unless they voluntarily accept a cash lump sum and a plane ticket out of the country. Armenian crisis deepened Wednesday as tens of thousands of people took to the street after the opposition accused the government of refusing to negotiate a transfer of power following the resignation of veteran leader Sargsyan. Authorities beefed up security in the capital Yerevan, cordoning off buildings housing the government and the ruling Republican Party, and deploying hundreds of police and several armored personnel carriers. Protesters shouted, clapped, whistled, beat drums, and tooted car horns in demonstrations that underscored the political turmoil gripping the impoverished former Soviet Republic. Led by 42-year-old Nikol Pashinyan, thousands of demonstrators marched through Yerevan against the Republican Party's unwillingness to facilitate the transfer of power after former President Sargsyan stood down Monday from his new post of Prime Minister. Demonstrators warned of possible clashes with the authorities if a solution to the crisis was not found. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani has questioned the legitimacy of efforts by the United States and its European allies to change a nuclear deal with his country. The U.S. and French leaders announced on Tuesday that they were working on a new deal that will expand and extend the terms of the 2015 accord. But Mr. Rouhani said they had no right to negotiate a 7-party agreement. He also dismissed U.S. President Donald Trump as a tradesman not qualified to comment on global treaties. Mr. Trump has said the U.S. will reimpose sanctions on Iran suspended under the deal on 12th May unless Congress and European powers fix its disastrous flaws. Danish inventor Peter Madsen was sentenced to life in prison Wednesday after he was found guilty of the brutal torture, murder and dismemberment of journalist Kim Wall aboard Madsen's homemade submarine in 2017. Judge Annette Boko at the Copenhagen City Court said she and the 2 jurors agreed Wall's death was a murder, saying Madsen didn't give a trustworthy explanation. In Denmark, a life sentence equates to 16 years, which can be extended if necessary. Boko added it was the court's opinion that Madsen dismembered the body to conceal the evidence from the crime he had committed. Madsen stood quietly listening as the judge read out the verdict and later said he would appeal the murder conviction and life sentence. Wall, a 30-year-old freelance journalist, set out on the submarine on August 10 to interview Madsen, the co-founder of a company that develops and builds manned spacecraft. Her remains were found in plastic bags on the Baltic seabed weeks later. 4 mass graves have been unearthed in Rwanda, which is believed to date from the 1994 genocide. For this and more, let's join Lulu Odu.
4 mass graves have been unearthed in Rwanda, which are believed to date from the 1994 genocide. The sites were found in the Gasabo district outside the capital, Kigali, and about 200 bodies have been exhumed. Around 3,000 people from the area went missing during the massacre, and local people believe the graves may contain all of the bodies. Some 800,000 people, ethnic Tutsis and moderate Hutus, were slaughtered in 100 days by Hutu militias. The graves were uncovered 2 weeks after commemorations were held to mark the start of the killings. Volunteers are leading the search after being told of the location of the graves by a woman who claims to have seen bodies dumped there.
An Indian guru with millions of followers was sentenced to life in prison Wednesday for raping a teenage devotee on the pretext of ridding her of evil spirits. Kabul, of India's most charismatic and controversial government, was given the maximum sentence at a closed jailhouse hearing in Rajasthan state, where hundreds of police were on high alert for any backlash from his disciples. The white-bearded guru, 77, has always denied raping the then 16-year-old in 2013 during a spiritual retreat at his ashram in Jaipur. His lawyer said they would appeal the sentence. U.S. President Donald Trump has said that some immensely wealthy countries in the Middle East have to pay for American protection and deploy their own troops in Syria. Speaking at a news conference with French President Emmanuel Macron on Tuesday, Trump said these countries wouldn't last a week without U.S. support. Trump said countries that are in the area, some of which are immensely wealthy, would not be there except for the United States and to a lesser extent France. Trump did not name the countries but stressed that they will pay, before adding that they will also put soldiers on the ground.
The Spanish Coast Guard says Thursday 5 migrants have died trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea after rescuing at least 105 others, while bad weather was hindering its search for another 2 boats with dozens aboard. Rescue boats and helicopters from southern Spain carried out a series of rescue operations late Wednesday and early Thursday. They spotted 3 boats, but 1 capsized and 4 migrants were already dead in the water some 40 kilometers off Morocco's coast. Another of those rescued died later of cardiac arrest. French President Emmanuel Macron has said he may have failed in efforts to persuade Donald Trump to stick to an international nuclear deal with Iran. Mr. Trump has until 12 May to decide on which aimed to prevent Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. He has been a strong critic of the accord, calling it insane. On Wednesday, Mr. Macron used similar language to describe frequent shifts in the U.S. position on global issues, including climate change and Iran agreement. Under the terms of the agreement reached under Mr. Trump's predecessor, Barack Obama, Iran agreed to limit its controversial nuclear program in return for an easing of economic sanctions. British Prime Minister Theresa May faces a key test Thursday as members of Parliament debate the decision to leave the European Customs Union. May has ruled out joining a customs union but is under increasing pressure to negotiate one in some form. Pro-EU campaigner says leaving the single market will have major implications for trade and the economy and could even threaten the Northern Ireland peace process. Thursday's motion calls on the government to reconsider its decision, but Brexit Minister David Davis is standing firm. Thursday's debate comes as May was dealt a new defeat in the House of Lords on Wednesday after her Brexit plan, adding to pressure to make concessions. Kim Jong-un is said to become the first North Korean leader to cross into South Korean territory since the end of the Korean War in 1953, as final details are put in place for the summit. South Korea says President Moon Jae-in will personally meet Mr. Kim at the border on Friday. The historic summit will focus on the North's recent indication it could be willing to give up its nuclear weapons. Talks are also proposed between Mr. Kim and U.S. President Trump by early June. Mr. Kim is said to cross the military's demarcation line, a clearly defined marker of the official land border between the territories. 8 Taiwanese drug smugglers were sentenced to death by an Indonesian court Thursday after being nabbed with over a ton of crystal methamphetamine. The men who were arrested during raids last July when the narcotics network's suspected leader was killed in a shootout with Indonesian police were sentenced at the South Jakarta District Court. Indonesia has some of the world's toughest anti-drug laws, with sentences including death penalty for smugglers who carry 5 or more grams. An Israeli court has sentenced a former border policeman for shooting dead a teenage Palestinian protester in 2014. Ben-Deri was given a 9-month term for killing 17-year-old Nadim Nawara during a protest at the Beitunia checkpoints in the occupied West Bank. Jerry pleaded guilty to causing death by negligence after prosecutors dropped the charge of manslaughter. It is rare for Israeli security forces to be imprisoned in connection with the deaths of Palestinian protesters. A second teenager, Mohammed Abutar, 16, was killed at the same protest, but Israeli prosecutors said there was insufficient evidence to pursue any charges. And the United Nations has said that 10 aid workers are missing in civil war-torn South Sudan just days after another group of humanitarians were abducted by gunmen. For this and more, let's join Tosin Olagunju.
The United Nations says 10 aid workers are missing in civil war-torn South Sudan just days after another group of humanitarians was abducted by gunmen. A UN statement says the 3 UN staffers and 7 aid workers, all of them South Sudanese, went missing on Wednesday when their convoy driving from Ye town to Tor in central Equatoria disappeared. The aid workers are with South Sudanese Development Organization, Across Plan International and Action Africa Help. South Sudan is one of the world's most dangerous places for humanitarians. The UN calls this the third such incident in just 6 months. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron has said he may have failed in efforts to persuade Donald Trump to retain an international nuclear deal with Iran. Mr. Macron said at the end of a 3-day state visit to the US, in his view, Trump will get rid of this deal on his own for domestic reasons. Mr. Trump has until 12 May to decide on the deal, which aimed to prevent Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. He has been a strong critic of the deal, calling it insane. Under the agreement reached under Mr. Trump's predecessor Barack Obama, Iran agreed to mothball its nuclear programs in return for an easing of economic sanctions. Mr. Macron made changing the US president's mind on Iran a top priority for his visit, but ended up admitting there was a big risk Mr. Trump would abandon the deal. He agreed with Mr. Trump that any deal should include a wider agreement on Iran's influence in the Middle East and should cover the country's nuclear activities longer term as well as its ballistic missile program. He however said he would work with Mr. Trump to build a new framework in the Middle East and especially in Syria. Kim Jong-un is said to become the first North Korean leader to cross into South Korean territory since the end of the Korean War in 1953, as final details are put in place for the summit. South Korea said President Moon Jae-in would personally meet Mr. Kim at the border at 9:30 local time on Friday. The historic summit will focus on the North's recent indications it could be willing to give up its nuclear weapons. Talks are also proposed between Mr. Kim and US President Trump by early June.
And for Foreign News Friday, our correspondent is standing by.
A train in South Africa has struck a vehicle at a railway crossing, killing 7 men in the same place where 10 children died in a similar accident in 2010. Authorities are investigating the cause of the collision on Friday at the Boskift crossing in Cape Town, site of memorial to the victims of the 2010 crash. South African media says the victims of Friday's accident were workers in the pickup truck that was on the railway tracks. Photographs from the scene show their crumpled vehicle. The driver of the vehicle in the 2010 case was sentenced to 8 years in prison for manslaughter. In a dramatic early Friday announcement, North and South Korea leaders agreed to a framework that could finally bring peace to the peninsula and potentially end decades of tensions between the Hamid Kingdom and the global community. The announcement was made by the North Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in of the South Korea after talks of the border. The two also agreed to push towards turning the armistice that ended the Korean War in 1953 into a peace treaty this year. It comes just months after war-like rhetoric from North Korea. Details of how denuclearization would be achieved were not made clear, and many analysts remain skeptical about the North's apparent enthusiasm for engagement. An issue for the North is the security guarantee extended by the US, a nuclear power to South Korea and Japan, and its military presence in both countries. Previous inter-Korean agreements have included similar pledges, but were later abandoned after the North resorted to nuclear and missile tests in the South elected more conservative president. Following Friday's summit, Mr. Kim said the two leaders have agreed to work to prevent a repeat of the region's unfortunate history in which progress had fizzled out. US President Donald Trump hailed Friday's Korea summit as historic, but one that only time will tell. In a second tweet, Trump wrote Korean War to end. The United States and all of its great people should be very proud of what is now taking place in Korea. The summit between the two Koreans was the highest level encounter yet in a whirlwind of nuclear diplomacy, and intended to pave the way for the much anticipated encounter between Kim and Trump. That's all from Foreign News. I am Al-Hassan Bala.
And that has been the World News Review on Independent Television Abuja. Many thanks for staying with us. I'm Kiru Obuli. Enjoy the rest of the day.